just turned it off. As a mom, I would never go in the shower when there's a baby cars.
Where are these kids?
That is Carla Marie Faith, the owner and operator of Play Mountain Place Daycare Center in El Paso County, Colorado. On the afternoon of November 13th, 2019, she was standing in her own backyard, watching 2 police officers and 2 licensing officials close in on a secret she had spent the better part of that day trying to keep buried, literally. Inside her home, beneath the floors they had been walking across for over an hour, 25 children were hidden in a basement. The youngest was 2 years old. Not one of them could have come to the door if they tried. The licensing complaints against Carla Faith had been building for months. Her license permitted a maximum of 6 children at that location, with no more than 2 under the age of 2 in her care at any one time. Investigators had already linked her to a second property, an unlicensed location where she was running additional childcare operations entirely off the books. The complaints were filed anonymously. Parents were nervous. The paper trail was thin. But on the morning of November 13th, a mother confirmed she had dropped her toddler off at the residence, and then Carla told licensing officials there were no children present. That contradiction, a mother with a receipt and an owner with a denial, is what brought Officer Landon to the property. What she found there would result in 26 felony charges against Carla Faith, a prison sentence, and a licensing investigation that exposed just how systematically a daycare operation could be weaponized against the very children it was trusted to protect. Carla had not acted alone. There were employees on the property, there was a friend, there was a woman in the basement, and every one of them at some point that afternoon had looked a uniformed officer in the face and lied. He had not factored in one thing, or rather, Carla had not. Sound travels through vents. Before we continue, have you ever dropped a child off somewhere and just trusted that they were safe the entire time? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. We cover cases like this every week. Carla Marie Faith was born in the early 1970s in Colorado Springs, Colorado, a mid-sized military city nestled at the base of Pikes Peak where the economy ran on defense contracts and the school district was stretched thin across a sprawling grid of working-class neighborhoods. She grew up in a household where childcare was not an abstraction. It was a daily logistics problem. Her mother worked variable shifts, the kind of schedule that meant Carla and her siblings were often responsible for themselves after school. Her father was present in the household but not consistently employed. There were at least 2 younger siblings. The apartment they shared in the city's south end was small enough that boundaries between spaces were mostly theoretical. Neighbors who knew the family from that period described Carla as capable and managing, someone who knew how to keep things running when adults weren't paying attention. Teachers at her elementary school noted that she was organized and directed, good at supervising group activities, confident in ways that other children her age were not. She did not struggle socially. She did not appear to struggle at all. What she developed, quietly, without anyone naming it, was an aptitude for controlling environments, for knowing who was watching and who was not. She completed high school without academic distinction, but without incident either. No disciplinary record, no notable absences. She was the kind of student administrators remember as reliably present, which is different from being remembered at all. After graduation, she did not pursue a 4-year degree. She took early childhood education courses at a community college, enough to satisfy the state's certification requirements for operating a licensed home daycare. She passed the background checks. She completed the CPR training. She filed the paperwork. And at some point in the mid-2000s, Play Mountain Place opened for business. For the first several years, by all available accounts, the operation was unremarkable. Parents in the neighborhood needed care. Carla offered it. The rates were competitive and the location was accessible. She built a client base through word of mouth, the way most small home daycares do. One family referring another, a reputation assembled from pickup conversations and Facebook posts, and the simple fact that nothing had gone wrong yet. She expanded slowly. She hired staff. She took on more children. At some point, the math changed. The children enrolled at Play Mountain Place came from working families. Single parents, two-income households, people whose schedules did not bend. These were not families with backup options or the financial cushion to absorb a gap in care. When they dropped their children off in the morning, they drove to work. They answered phones. They stocked shelves. They did not call to check in because checking in was not something their circumstances permitted. They trusted the license on the wall because the license was supposed to mean something. One mother, whose 2-year-old was among the children found in the basement that afternoon, had dropped her child off at Play Mountain Place that very morning. She had gone to work. She had received a call from licensing officials, not from Carla. She had been told obliquely that there might be a situation at the center. She drove to the property and was met by a police officer on the sidewalk. She had no idea at that moment that her child was underground. None of the parents did. Several of these families had noticed things in the weeks and months prior. Children coming home unsettled, sleep disruptions, a toddler who had begun refusing the dark. These details would not surface in interviews until after the arrests. Before November 13th, they were private worries, the kind that parents talk themselves out of because the alternative is too difficult to consider. Colorado's home daycare licensing system is built on a foundational assumption that a provider who passes an initial background check and agrees to capacity limits will operate within those limits on an ongoing basis. Unannounced inspections do occur, but they are not frequent. The system is designed around compliance, not surveillance. Licensing officials conduct reviews, field complaints, and issue citations, but their authority to enter a property without consent is limited. They cannot compel entry. They cannot search. The structural blind spot is this: between inspections, a licensed provider's interior is effectively invisible to the state. A provider who knows the inspection schedule, or who is simply willing to manage optics on short notice, can operate well outside their permitted parameters for extended periods without triggering a formal response. Complaints can be filed anonymously, which protects reporters but also means they carry less evidentiary weight at the outset. The system assumed that the license conferred not just permission but intention, that the provider who passed the check would remain the provider who showed up each morning. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. The first documented anomaly in Carla Faith's operation was not a child in a basement, it was a number. Specifically, it was the number of backpacks. At some point in 2019, investigators would later establish the timeline through licensing complaint records and parent interviews. Carla began accepting children well beyond her permitted capacity of 6. The second property, the unlicensed location, had been running parallel to the licensed one for long enough that it had its own rhythm, its own staff rotations, its own intake process. Parents at the unlicensed site had no paperwork trail with the state. They had a phone number and a drop-off time. Some of them did not know the location was unlicensed. Some of them may not have known what a license required. By the fall of 2019, Carla was managing what amounted to a shadow childcare network. 2 properties, multiple staff members, dozens of enrolled children. The licensed location provided legitimacy. The unlicensed one provided capacity. The arrangement required coordination, discretion, and the ongoing cooperation of employees who understood, at least implicitly, that what they were doing did not conform to what the state believed was happening. Christina Swagger, who introduced herself to officers that afternoon as simply a friend, was in fact an employee. She had been working at the facility long enough to know the protocols. Caitlin Nelson, the woman found in the basement with 25 children, had been babysitting for Carla for approximately 2 months by her own account. Valerie Fresquez was a 4th employee on the premises that day. These were not casual participants. They were operational components of a system that had been running long enough to develop its own internal logic. The morning of November 13th began like any other. Parents arrived. Children were dropped off. Backpacks were hung. Carla knew the licensing officials were coming, or suspected it. The complaint had been filed. The appointment had been requested. And at some point before the officials arrived, a decision was made. The children would go into the basement. What happened in the roughly 2 hours between the children being moved underground and Officer Parker finding the access point beneath the deck is documented in the body cam footage with uncomfortable clarity. Carla left the property through the back gate. She told licensing officials she had no children in her care that day. She claimed to have ducked out for lunch. She was seen being picked up by a black Camaro and then returned to the property through the rear entrance after watching from a distance to assess the situation. She lied about the car. She lied about where she had been. She sat in her backyard and answered questions with the calibrated composure of someone who had calculated that if she could simply outlast the inquiry, it would pass. She had done it before. Not with children in a basement, perhaps, but she had managed licensing scrutiny without consequence for long enough to believe she understood its limits. She knew that licensing officials could not compel entry. She knew that a police officer needed probable cause. She played to both of those constraints simultaneously, presenting a surface of cooperation while engineering delay at every turn. What she had not accounted for was the vent. Children's music, the kind that plays on a loop, tinny and repetitive, travels through ductwork in ways that are difficult to predict and impossible to suppress quickly. Officer Landon heard it first, then a second officer confirmed it. Then critically, a child cried. That sound, approximately 6 to 10 seconds of audible distress from an unknown location beneath the floorboards, shifted the legal calculation entirely. An officer who can articulate that they heard a child crying from inside a structure has probable cause. The ambiguity collapsed. Carla, standing in the backyard, watched Officer Landon's expression change. She had been texting. The music stopped almost immediately after she was seen on her phone, but the crying had already been heard, and 2 experienced officers had heard it together. The discovery itself was made by Officer Parker, who located the access point on the exterior of the structure, a concealed entry beneath the deck on the north side of the property, fitted with blinds that had been closed from the inside. The opening was not visible from the main yard. It was not mentioned in any licensing documentation. It was, by every available indication, a space that had been prepared for use as a childcare area while remaining entirely invisible to state oversight. What the officers found when they descended into that room defied the reassurances that had been offered to them for the previous 2 hours. 25 children, toddlers and young children, seated or lying on the floor in a low-ceilinged underground room that smelled of soil and diapers. Caitlin Nelson was with them. The children were alive. They were not visibly injured, but they had been placed underground in the dark by adults they trusted, while uniformed officers searched the house above them. The youngest was 2 years old. Officer Landon's first words upon entering the basement were directed at the children. "Hi, babies. It's okay, guys." Then she turned to Caitlin Nelson. "Who are you, and why are you hiding all these kids down here?" The investigation that followed moved quickly. Caitlin Nelson was placed under arrest on the spot. A warrant check revealed she had an active outstanding warrant at the time of the incident. She told officers she had been babysitting for about 2 months, that she didn't know all the parents' names, that she wasn't sure how long they had been in the basement. "Maybe an hour," she said. A later affidavit from Christina Swagger contradicted that timeline. According to Swagger's statement, Carla had instructed staff to move all of the children into the basement earlier that day, well before the licensing officials arrived, and well before Officer Landon knocked on the front door. The children had been underground in that room while adults walked across the floors above them and told police there was no one home. The backpacks, stacked against the wall and covered with a blanket in the main house, bore the names of children from multiple families. 13 backpacks counted by Officer Landon, each one representing a parent who had dropped off a child that morning and gone to work without knowing what would happen next. The backpacks had been covered deliberately. Carla had attempted to sit on the blanket concealing them when Officer Landon first approached. Stories like this don't get the attention they deserve. If you want to see more accountability coverage like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell. What happens next is what brings the full weight of it into focus. The chain of escalation from complaint to arrest had taken less than a single afternoon, but the conditions that made it possible had been building for the better part of a year. Licensing officials had already been building a file on the unlicensed second property before November 13th. A separate complaint had been filed by a parent at that location. The complaints were anonymous, which meant they were processed more slowly. The citations being prepared against Carla for the unlicensed location were, by the licensing official's own account on the body cam footage, already in progress that day. That investigation had been the original reason for the visit. It was a parent call, not a licensing complaint, that escalated the situation to law enforcement. A mother had confirmed her 2-year-old had been dropped off. Carla had denied it. That discrepancy, a confirmed drop-off against a categorical denial, was the thread that unraveled everything. Officer Landon pulled it. Carla was placed in handcuffs in her own backyard, surrounded by licensing officials and a growing number of responding officers, while parents were called one by one and told to come collect their children. Her coffee, by all accounts, was still warm on the kitchen counter. The files on her desk were still open. The children's music, somewhere beneath the house, had finally gone silent. The smoking gun was not the basement. The basement was the crime scene. The smoking gun was the text message. Investigators recovered Carla Faith's phone records in the days following the arrest. The sequence was precise and damning. At the exact moment Officer Landon verbalized within Carla's earshot that she could hear music coming from beneath the house, Carla sent a text message. Within seconds, the music stopped. The text had gone to someone in the basement. Someone with a phone. Someone who had been instructed in real time to silence the children, or at minimum to silence the device that was betraying their location. The message did not say, "Hide the kids." It didn't have to. The timing said everything that words could not. A licensed childcare provider had used a text message to coordinate the concealment of 25 toddlers from law enforcement officers who were standing 10 feet above them. That was the moment, prosecutors would later argue, where any claim of accidental overcapacity ended and deliberate obstruction of a child welfare investigation began. Carla Marie Faith was charged on multiple counts. The primary charges included 26 counts of child abuse without injury, 1 count per child, each classified as a felony under Colorado statute. She was additionally charged with 1 felony count of attempting to influence a public servant, arising from her sustained campaign of misdirection directed at Officer Landon and the licensing officials throughout the afternoon. A misdemeanor charge of obstructing a peace officer was added for her physical and verbal interference with the search of the property. The child abuse charges were the anchor, 26 of them. 1 for every child who had been placed underground and hidden from the people whose legal obligation was to verify their safety. The case was heard in El Paso County District Court. The prosecution's strategy was methodical and document-heavy. Phone records, licensing files, the body cam footage in its entirety, and the testimony of parents who described what their children had been like in the weeks and months that followed. The defense attempted to argue that the overcapacity, while a violation, did not constitute abuse, that the children had not been harmed, that the basement was a supervised space, and that Carla's actions, however misguided, reflected panic rather than malice. The jury was not persuaded. The most devastating testimony came not from a licensing official or a police officer, but from a mother. She had dropped her 2-year-old off that morning and gone to her job at a call center on the east side of Colorado Springs. She had been at her desk for less than 3 hours when her phone rang. She described in testimony what it felt like to drive to the property and be met by a uniformed officer on the sidewalk. C described asking where her child was. She described the pause before the officer answered. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Judge G. David Miller addressed Carla Faith directly at sentencing. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He read from the record with the measured precision of someone who understood that the facts, stated plainly, were sufficient. He noted that Carla Faith had operated a licensed child care facility, a designation that exists specifically because the state recognizes that parents cannot be present to protect their children during working hours and therefore extends its own protection in their place. She had accepted that designation. She had accepted the trust it represented. And then she had used the physical infrastructure of that trust, the licensed address, the familiar faces, the morning drop-off routine, to run an operation that the state had explicitly prohibited in a space the state had no knowledge of, while telling the parents of 25 children that their sons and daughters were safe. He referenced her own words from the body cam footage. Her statement to Officer Landon, "I did all of that and I'm guilty of all of that," had been entered into evidence. He read it back to her. He noted that she had said it in the context of trying to negotiate her way out of handcuffs, not in the context of genuine accountability. He noted the text message. He noted the music stopping. He noted that a 2-year-old child had spent an unknown number of hours in an underground room while her mother sat at a desk 20 minutes away believing her daughter was being cared for. Carla Marie Faith was sentenced to 6 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. She received credit for time served. She is currently eligible for parole with a hearing scheduled for August 2025. She will be in her mid-50s at her earliest possible release. She has not made any public statements since sentencing. She did not look at the families seated in the gallery when the sentence was read. She looked at a fixed point on the wall to her left and did not move. Caitlin Nelson, the woman found in the basement with the children, pled guilty to 26 counts of child abuse without injury and 1 felony count of possession of controlled substances. The controlled substance charge added a layer to the already disturbing picture of what supervision in that basement had actually looked like. She was sentenced to 365 days in county jail with credit for 135 days of time served. She was additionally ordered to serve 4 years of probation, requiring her to complete a substance abuse evaluation and comply with all recommended treatment, maintain monitored sobriety, complete a child abuse evaluation with recommended treatment, and perform 200 hours of community service. She failed to appear for her original court date. This was not an isolated pattern. She had failed to appear for multiple prior charges. The system caught up with her eventually, as it does, but not before she had spent 2 months in a basement with other people's children. Christina Swagger, who had introduced herself to officers as simply a friend, who had stood in the backyard answering questions with practiced calm, who had been identified by a later affidavit as the person who relayed Carla's instructions to move the children underground, was convicted of 26 counts of child abuse without injury, 1 felony count of attempting to influence a public servant, and a misdemeanor count of obstructing a peace officer. She was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of parole. She is currently serving that parole. Valerie Fresquez, a 4th employee present at the property that day, pled guilty to 26 counts of child abuse without injury and accepted a plea agreement that required her to testify against her former colleagues. She received a 2-year deferred sentence in March 2021. She completed its terms in March 2023, at which point she was permitted to withdraw her guilty plea and have all charges dismissed. She is, as of the public record, a free woman with no criminal conviction. Whether that outcome reflects justice or the necessary cost of securing testimony against the others is a question the families of those 25 children have been left to answer for themselves. The parents did not receive a formal apology from the facility. They received a phone call telling them to come pick up their children when they could, and a separate call from Carla herself, captured in the body cam audio, in which she told families not to rush, that the business was closing down, delivered in the same calm, management voice she had used all afternoon. Several parents gave statements to local media in the months following the trial. One father, whose 3-year-old son had been among the children in the basement, described the months of sleep disruption that followed. His son would not sleep in a room with the light off for nearly a year. He could not explain to a 3-year-old what had happened or why. He could only sit in the doorway with the hallway light on and wait. A mother whose daughter had attended Play Mountain Place for 8 months prior to the incident described a detail that she said she could not stop thinking about. Her daughter, shortly after the arrest, had started asking, during bath time and before bed and at random moments in the car, whether the lights were going to go off. Not as a fear exactly, more as an expectation, as though darkness had become something that simply happened to you when adults decided it should. In the aftermath of the case, El Paso County licensing officials announced a review of home daycare inspection protocols with specific attention to unlicensed secondary locations and the procedures for responding to anonymous complaints. Whether those procedural changes were implemented in full and whether they have been maintained is a matter of ongoing public record. What is not in dispute is the gap they were designed to close, the gap between what a license says is happening and what is actually happening in the hours and days and months when no one official is watching. Play Mountain Place no longer operates. The property has since changed hands. The children who were in that basement on November 13, 2019 are between 4 and 8 years old now. They do not remember Officer Landon's voice. They do not remember the word babies spoken into the dark by someone they had never met in a tone designed to tell them that whatever was happening was over. But some of them, for a time, remembered the dark. And some of their parents are still sitting in doorways with the hallway light on. That is what a license is supposed to prevent. If this kind of accountability coverage matters to you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. And the case on your screen right now involves a caretaker whose betrayal didn't last one afternoon. It lasted years, and the people who trusted her never saw it coming. Click it.